All right. Hi, I'm William Bryant, and this is the companion piece for the production budget. And so I'm going to, this is a bit longer one. I wanted to make sure that I covered everything that I had in that article, or at least mention some of it. So I'm going to be looking at my laptop from time to time here to kind of make sure that I get everything. But the idea behind the production budget is once you've once you put out your sales numbers or your anticipated sales numbers, the the production, or I mean, in some cases this is going to be your inventory, which I mean, you do have an end inventory budget too for those who are hoping to carry. But obviously, I'm kind of addressing things from a manufacturing setting or people or industries that are going to have direct material, direct labor, as you've kind of seen from my list. But the idea is that everything is looking at capacity. I mean, this is going to be a key term in production, and I think it's something that should be bared in mind or at least thought of, because in order to meet sales revenues, you need to have capacity. All right. For example, warehouse or at least storage or a place that you can store the required number of units, whatever it is that you may be. That could be retail, your back room for certain distribution centers or channels, your big box stores. Do you have the capacity to meet the anticipated product line units that are going to be sold over that period? How many shipments are you going to have in? I mean, that's kind of a if you get into economic order quantity and the carry costs and such, it's related, but just kind of something to keep in the back of your mind, because there is an optimization that goes into that. But yes, your capacity, not only capacity when you're looking at, do you have the ability for storage for the inventory, which may or may not be on site, mind you, but then you have your logistics. But then you roll back even further. Do you have the capacity to, if you're actually making these, to hold the materials necessary to assemble them? Do you have the capacity and the throughput in your operations to put out the number that you need to meet whatever your end goal of carry is for the ending inventory for that month once you've met the obligations for sales? So capacity in storage operations, these are important considerations to think of when you're putting down that revenue number. And that's why the production, or if you want to think of it in terms of like inventory portion of the budget, is important. Because just because you think you can project out a number, can you meet the obligations for that number? Other things that come into play, which is that cost of carry aspect, obsolescence, spoilage. Uh, in your supply chain, you might run into supply issues. the There are other things that go into play, but that's why in the production budget, I think I mentioned constraint and capacity over and over and over again, because that's really what you're looking at when you're putting together um, your production budget, because that's you are going to need a certain number of units that you're going to sell, and then you're going to come up with a certain number of units that you need to have on hand. I mean, you kind of think of it as, to start on hand for the next month, but obviously it's your operations are continuous. What it is you're continually producing at that throughput to gain that number of units, or you're purchasing that many units, so you have your safety stocks. But you're doing so because of the fact that you're adjusting for any changes to the rate of sales that may come up. And you want to also be able to be a bit dynamic in that, because you want to have an ability, and this is why I talk about an integrated budget system, to tell when you're perhaps carrying a little bit too much or too little below or above your safety stocks, and you want to be able to tell right away. especially if you're doing things from a manufacturing perspective. You don't want to have your stockouts. You don't want to lose money because you don't have it. You don't want to lose face with the customer. You're trying to build a brand. You're trying to build loyalty. These things are important. They become they become an issue. And I know this seems to be outside the aspect of the finance and accounting when you're putting together your budgeting system, but this is where this input assists, because at these levels, when you integrate it, you should be able to adjust your sensitivity and see what happens, to kind of play out scenarios that might pop up within your industry or within your supply chain environment. Let's just go through some of the things kind of that I had meant on or put together here. I think I've covered most of the aspects of the capacity and the fact that you have too little or too much inventory, and the fact that this does play in to additional considerations. The cost of your carry, going back to it, you may need additional space and storage if you begin carrying too much, or if you're a restaurant, you may see spoilage. And so, whereas within the world of accounting and keeping track, a certain amount of spoilage is considered normal, the excess spoilage is not, and that becomes a period cost that goes into your expenses against your profit. And so there are things to keep into consideration when you're doing these measures. Okay, I did mention I'll go into my working example, and mostly because this is an inventory example. I mentioned, and I tend to stress, a study of customer behavior, because customer behavior and trends, it can catch you off guard. And if it does, you want to be able to react to the degree that you possibly can. I use the example from the shutdown or partial shutdown within the country in the pandemic. The reason being is because when people were at home, you saw certain shortages in supply because the behavior and the dynamics of the value perceived by the customer or consumer changed. At-home projects suddenly became a thing, and you couldn't suddenly adjust supply chains to meet that latest trend or latest thing. And so, of course, our supply and demand prices increased. We saw this in lumber. You saw it in a number of home goods and items. The reason why I bring it up is because within a particular industry that I was working, it was, there were product lines that were tailored around outdoor activity. Because outdoor activity in parks was, for the most part, in most areas, fine, because you weren't around anybody and it was open, and outdoor activities became one of the only kind of social events that you could really do. People began investing in items that would enhance the outdoor social activity. When these items are in your sales mix, usually third or fourth down, maybe not the most prominently sold item due to higher prices, but they are higher margin, and they suddenly become your dominant product, and they carry revenues. And for these particular ones, you're able to meet that demand. It might be assumed that these revenues and these units are going to carry forward, because sometimes the only thing that's viewed is top line, and that's it. Total revenue, where is it at? Is it growing? And that's all you got. The considerations for the sales mix, the various prices that go into it, and the reason why you see a certain margin, top level margin gross, and is due to that change, and then you presume it's going to carry forward, or you presume that the reason why it's declining isn't due to the fact that things are changing in the environment and customers are being kind of tapered back to normal behavior, but that there just simply isn't enough inventory. And so that's where this kind of comes into play, because that was the belief. The sales mix wasn't really looked into, and for whatever reason, but so it was the belief that there should be more inventory, and that more inventory required space, carry. Since it was financed, it was financial costs that go into it, which obviously isn't a product cost, but nonetheless, it's cash flow out. You have to consider it, and so that's where the whole belief and strategy came into play. You can't sell it if you don't have it, right? That was the push for it, and it was always in the back of my mind. It doesn't matter if you have it if nobody wants to buy it, was my whole belief to it, and then that's where it always comes in. Yeah, you have to have it because you want to prevent stockouts, but if you have a whole lot of something that nobody wants, it doesn't matter how much of it you have, nobody's going to buy it. And so the understanding of customer behavior trends, in addition to your projections for revenues and how you're going to create the production budget or inventory budget to create the support for your revenues, but also what are these based on? And I think I probably mentioned that in the sales budget. What is it based on? What is the sales mix? What is the consumer behavior? What have the trends been? Are they changing trends? If something changes, do you have the dynamic capability to adjust to the changes? Just things to consider. And that's where my working example came into play and why I wanted to bring that up. Hopefully that kind of fell in line with what I was talking about. Okay. Okay, I think I've gone through enough of the laptop piece, so just have to edit some of that space out there. So just kind of a quick recap, since I talked about it. When doing the production budget, when doing the inventory budget, you may have to implement some long-term strategic planning or a capital budget in addition to it, depending on what it is that you're mapping out in terms of strategy. You may also be looking at your inventory carry and whether or not you can make adjustments to it, once again, to the behavior. And that, again, that's why, because you might not know this if you're doing the FP&A aspect and you're just running it from a finance and accounting perspective, but I'm sure operations would have discussed something like this, especially if you bring numbers to them and you look at forward projections and you interact with anticipated sales on marketing, with the marketing team or the sales team, and you get together and begin these discussions, because you'd be surprised what information is siloed and what doesn't really become available to everybody until the very last minute. It's really remarkable, because some of the information could impact strategies that are being designed and implemented in budgets that are being planned within departments and segments throughout a company. The more that you push for that coordination, integration, and communication, the better it is, and the more accurate the budgets can be when you're actually planning them out. Because this really is, once you get down into production, it is a mapping of the operations, and it is a mapping of what operations anticipates for expenditures to create the production, especially when it comes to facilities management or the facilities you have, logistics, the labor and workers that just handle that overhead, let alone the actual materials and labor that go into direct and prime, the prime costs of production. And so you do need to consider these things, because you take the step down from the production budget and you are sitting in your direct materials, direct labor, and then manufacturing overhead, which, even if you're not a manufacturing company, depending on what you have, you may have considerations for your budget. It might be useful to budget out commissions and sales costs, or other labor that goes into services provided. For example, if you are a service-based company, but you could actually be retail and offer service at the same time. And so a little mapping, a little planning, and all of these things begin to flow into each other anyway. And so that's where you get your integration. And then, because these are pieces that are laid out, and the fact that when you really get, I know granularly people they do not want to get into it, because I think a lot of it is, it gets confusing and there's a lack of understanding. And then there's also the aspect of different methodologies for accounting for things in inventory. Inventory is a very interesting piece for the accountants to deal with. And so then they just want to avoid it. But the fact is that you have to do some of your allocations and kind of create a budget anyway. And so you may very well have some of these in line to integrate, create a budget based upon activities that are already being done. You can compare them to actuals. You may get a better, more accurate overall budget process and budget dynamics for analysis. And then on top of that, hopefully, because you can read variance along the way, especially if you're doing some kind of a standard costing method for which you can measure against, for labor or cost for materials or whatever, then you may be able to be more dynamic, because you're going to see, whoa, we are way over variance in this area. Why? What is it? Are we seeing trend changes? That's kind of what I try to bring up in the sales budget with price changes. Are you seeing changes in the trends? And that's why you want a little bit granularly broken out into price tiers, because maybe you're seeing a breakdown in the highest price tier. Well, usually it'd be kind of probably below that, because if you've seen with luxury items, even in bad times, luxury items can still do quite well. And then in bad times, you're going to see luxury, and then like base items, like your quote unquote economically inferior goods that are the ones that you only purchase when you're getting squeezed for income. Well, if you see those, that should signal a dynamic that we might be in a downturn. And so that should make you look at the rest of the items and the units that you're selling and see, are these changes occurring? And so maybe by using price tiers and those dynamics, you can better adjust for production and inventory and have dynamic action relative to it.